Looks perfect.
Okay.
All
great.
right. So to respect everyone's time, I'll go ahead and get us started here. Thank you so much for joining us today for Positive Youth Development, hosted by HCET with presenter Dr. Charisse Nixon. My name is Jordan Murch. I'm a training manager at HCET, and I will be moderating the webinar today. Let me briefly introduce you to healthcare education and training. HCET's mission is to provide comprehensive program development, education, and training to improve reproductive and sexual health outcomes. HCET is an organization of passionate people who are proactive in their belief that access to evidence-based, medically accurate reproductive and sexual health education, training, and care is a fundamental right. For more information and to keep up to date with HCET events, please be sure to follow HCET on these social media platforms and visit our website at hcet.org. For additional training and professional development opportunities, visit our virtual learning website at learn.hcet.org. Now I will quickly review some housekeeping information. A link to complete an event evaluation will be sent to you via email following this training, and we will post the link in the chat at the end of the webinar. We do greatly appreciate your feedback. Archived presentations and a list of upcoming events can be viewed on our website. And if you have any technical difficulties during this presentation, please contact us at the email listed on your screen, updates@hcet.org. The presenter of this training does not disclose any actual, potential, or perceived conflicts of interest. And now I'd like to introduce you. Oh, go ahead. Thank you. Yes, if you would like to ask a question during this presentation, you can go down and use the chat, and we just want you to make sure that you select all panelists so that both Dr. Nixon and I can see your questions coming through. If the question is appropriate to answer at that time, Dr. Nixon will address it. However, we will wait to have most questions answered at the end of the webinar. And now I'd like to introduce you to your presenter for today. Dr. Nixon serves as a full professor of psychology at Penn State Behrend and as associate director for the Susan Hurt Hagen Center for Community Outreach, Research, and Evaluation, a center dedicated to promoting and sustaining positive communities for youth. She trains educators in the areas of bullying prevention and resilience throughout the United States. Her programs offer a unique integration of empirical research and practical strategies to help teachers, counselors, mental health professionals, and caring adults create environments that optimize developmental outcomes for children and adolescents. Dr. Nixon will challenge you to think about the current state of relationships within the context of cultural influences, as well as how to empower youth to establish and maintain constructive relationships over time. Without further ado, I will be turning things over to Dr. Nixon. Thank you.
Thanks, Jordan. And so before we get started, just so I know who's in the room, a big shout out to Jordan for inviting me. What I'd like you to do is put in the chat what your role is. And so if you're a parent, you're here. If you're an educator, if you're a counselor, just so I can kind of get a look at that. If you would take a minute to write in the chat so I can see where we are. Okay, educators, nurse, like it. Okay, educator, counselor, federal grants. Okay, all right, perfect. Some parent advocates, some teen coordinators. Perfect. We are here to talk about positive youth development. And in doing so, we have to talk about the science behind it. And so we're going to do that, and we have to ask the question, where do we start? So some objectives were given to you, and the 3 objectives, just to remind us what they were, I'm going to talk a little bit about the components of positive youth development. And this research, just so you know, kind of originated with Richard Lerner's work, but it's been around in terms of strengths perspective, and it's been around in terms of our movement as a science to focus on the positive. We're also going to talk about some strategies that you can actually take your knowledge and then uniquely take this science and adopt it and adapt it to different kinds of strategies. So let's start off looking at the culture. In terms of the research, what we know is our culture, any culture, should constructively meet basic needs. And those 4 basic needs are simple. I like acronyms, they're easy to remember. And Kip Williams from Purdue kind of gave us this research, but the acronyms are just as I teach my students, they're ABCs in me. And so all of you who work with youth are going to be working with youth in your own setting. And so all of you have to provide your youth with a place, a safe place for them to be accepted. That's the A. B is to belong. That's the B. C is for your youth to have some kind of control. And then it's A, B, C's and me. And the me is often not thought of. The me is often forgotten by us. And that is meaningful existence. All youth need to thrive. They have to feel their life is meaningful. And that meaningful existence tends to be in the science explored in the work on purpose. And so remember, we can get these needs met constructively or destructively. We can get the needs met constructively in youth settings. We can get the needs met destructively. A student could spread rumors or gossip or exclude or join a gang or whatever it may be. So the question comes, do we all have these 4 same basic needs? And the answer is yes, from the time we're young, we're growing, we're in middle school, we're young adults, we're middle-aged, all the way to grandmas and grandpas. Everybody's got the need, all 4 basic needs: to be accepted, to belong, to control, and to have meaningful existence. But what's unique is that our youth we're dealing with, adolescence, is that adolescence is such a time that these 4 needs are really salient. And so we're going to take a look at what that looks like and how that drives behavior. And as we do that, we need to think about how our culture has changed. So if you would, just for the youth that you work with, that you can think about, or that you have in your home, or however you want to do it, go ahead and write in the chat, how has our culture changed for kids? I'll give you a minute to do that. Okay, I see a few of you. Less time, social media. Good, good. I mean, that's not good, but yes, you're on it. And so what we know, let's kind of look at your responses. What we know is that research shows us that our youth are plugging more into electronics than they are to people. And so, particularly in light of our current culture, this is very significant. The other thing we know is that we tend to live in a culture that promotes apathy. And so we have to think about, can we develop strategies to promote positive youth development that show caring, concern, character? What we need to remember is that our neural architecture evolved under conditions of face-to-face. Now, although this has been the year and a half of Zoom, now that we're kind of coming back into our culture, research shows whenever we could have face-to-face relationships, the better. So we need to think what that looks like. And so let me ask you this. What are the effects of so much electronic communication? What are you seeing? Just go ahead and write it in the chat. What are you seeing? Mhm. Less adult interaction, less interaction with each other, no more feelings, struggle communicating. Yeah. And what the research suggests, less creativity, what the research suggests is that our culture is more isolated than ever before. And so again, my job is to bring you the science as it's related to this. And because we know we're living there, I saw someone in the chat write about more mental health issues. There are researchers, Jean Twenge and Keith Campbell, did work in 2019. They looked at a whole bunch of studies at a meta-analysis and found that what we know is that heavy users, when they defined heavy users, it's youth who use media social media for 5 hours a day or more. And for most of our youth, that is very, very common. And what they found was those who did it have lower levels of psychological well-being. They're less likely to be happy, and instead they have higher levels of depression and suicidal ideation. So we have to address this. In working with youth for many years, one of the things that I have found works best is for letting youth know that they're being exploited by technology, or in this case, or exploited by someone else or the media. No one likes to be told what to do. And so let them look at the research. My job today is also to give you some resources. If you haven't looked into Screenagers, this is a documentary on, and you could get it on YouTube, and I'm going to see if it'll play there for a minute, just to kind of give you an idea. No, it's not playing. Just give me a minute.
It's super fun playing on my mom's cell phone. It's awesome how you can watch videos on
Texting
YouTube.
and sharing photos.
Playing games on iPad.
It all started with one question. What new phone to get my daughter? I knew what Tessa wanted, a smartphone.
I'm gonna stop it there, but I do want to have you, if you have a chance, go watch that documentary with your students. It is written by a doctor, and it's who you just heard the words of. And it's just exploring from a kid's perspective too, what that looks like. And so one of the strategies then is teach your youth to question, teach teens to question, teach them not to be exploited. Now, if you have older youth, consider watching The Social Dilemma with them and then discussing it on Netflix. The second thing that's changed in our culture is COVID, and I'd be remiss if I didn't bring this up. We have a culture of COVID, and although we're coming out of it, it's affected our youth. It's affected us. It has brought uncertainty, isolation, financial strain, health risk. In other words, it's increased stress. There's a lot of research that's been emerging that have looked at what is the mental health among our youth and what does that look like? And what we know is it's worsening. Mental health issues are worsening. Children are interacting, and you had this in the chat, they're interacting with fewer and fewer caring adults. They're receiving less social support. And that's a big deal because social support is actually a component of positive youth development. And as we've said, they're having experienced more stress. So some things we can do. Even though we're all busy and we're doing things electronically, we still need to focus on relationships first. We need to connect before we give them any kind of content. And that is something that has been very helpful for me in teaching Zoom for 1.5 years. And I'm going to direct you to Chad Littlefield's work here. If you just want to jot his name down, he has a lot of strategies for connection before content. Another strategy is we know that our students are feeling like they do not have control, like there's nothing they can do. So one of the things we need to do is give them control when we can. Use the democratic process. And finally, check in. We need to check in with our youth. And when we say check in, the research suggests the individual check-ins are most effective. And yes, as a group, yeah, how are y'all doing? Those are great. But the research suggests just that individual one-on-one, doesn't have to be long, could be a quick text, an email, but it's the individual continual check-in that makes a difference. And so now let's turn our attention to look at how are our youth doing? How are our kids doing? Well, what we know from research is that trauma is pretty prevalent among our students. And according to SAMHSA, about almost half of the children in the United States have at least one adverse childhood experience, or ACE. And probably most of you are familiar with ACEs, but if you're not, they have a beautiful website there too with a lot of resources. Now you may ask, well, what is an adverse childhood experience? It's things like bullying, humiliation, divorce could be one, substance use in the home, neglect, COVID. All of these are examples that could potentially be adverse childhood experiences. But again, our job is to flip it on its head. Instead of looking at the negative, we're going to acknowledge that, but we need the balanced perspective. We then can build our child's PCEs, or positive childhood experiences. This is now an emerging literature. Instead of just focusing on ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, we need to be focusing on positive childhood experiences. So what can we do? What does that look like? Well, what are we doing as educators, as counselors, to promote and sustain strong connections with families, with peers, with a non-parental adult? Opportunities to develop confidence. That C, confidence, is part of positive youth development. Youth also need to feel like they are a valued member of the community. What we know from research is that our youth have fewer and fewer responsibilities. We think maybe we're doing youth a favor, but the research suggests we're not. Responsibilities build efficacy, they build character, they also build connection. All of that is what is known as positive youth development. Let's take a look now at our teens. We looked at kids. Over half have an adverse childhood experience. How are our adolescents doing? And as I get into the adolescents, I think it's really important for us to look at the developmental changes that are going on. All I'm going to highlight as a developmental psychologist, I want us to look at the brain and cognitive changes. I think it's important. So let's talk a little bit the cognitive change. Number one, they're focused on themselves. And if you know a youth, you work with youth, obviously we're all here together, you know how this looks. They're very egocentric. They tend to only take one perspective, and that's usually their own. And they tend to feel like nobody understands them. And that's really problematic because it leads to that feeling of isolation. All of us need to know that we are not alone. Again, leads to isolation and affects mental health. Before I move on to the prevalence of how the teens are doing, let me just briefly, and this is a whole different webinar, but let me just briefly give you some adolescent development that's going to be relevant for positive youth development. There are two systems in our brain. We have the cortical system, or the prefrontal cortex, and this allows us to plan ahead, to analyze a situation, to make pros and cons lists, to be very careful, to think before we say anything. And then we have the subcortical system. This is our hot button. This is impulsive. It's fast. It's reactive. What we need to get is that these develop unevenly. And actually, the subcortical system develops first. And under salient conditions that are emotional or salient conditions, the child and the teen is going to really struggle here. And that is because the prefrontal cortex, or the cortical system, is not yet mature. That doesn't mean we throw our hands up and go, oh, they're developing their PFC, there's nothing we can do. But in fact, we have to provide the opportunities for them to develop their prefrontal cortex, because the brain is plastic, it's flexible. And so the cortical system is under construction. And because of that, our youth have trouble controlling impulses, tend to struggle with outbursts. They tend to be a bit defensive. And the research at Boston with Deborah Yergel and Todd's work show us that they tend to misread facial expressions. And what facial expressions? They tend to see anger where there is none. And so you may have kids saying, why are you looking at me like that? Or why are you always mad at me? We have to help them label others' faces. We also have to help them give other people the benefit of the doubt. This is part of the training. So what do the trends look like? What do the trends in mental health look like for our teens? And I want us to think about that as we go through. Trends in mental health. Well, here's what we know. Between 2010 and 2015, 33% more adolescents have higher depressive symptoms. 31% more died by suicide. We know that 1 in 6 considered suicide in the past year. And 1/3 of suicides are associated with no risk factors at all. And this always kind of opens my eyes and reminds me, just by the very nature of being a teen and all the biological changes, the brain changes, the socio-emotional changes, the cognitive changes, puts youth at risk for ineffective decision-making. They need our help scaffolding that. The other thing we know is that about 1 in 5 youth suffer from major depressive episodes. 1 in 5. That's a big deal. And that leads to about, according to new recent research by Twenge and Campbell, 71% increase in serious psychological distress. And so what we know is that our kids are experiencing more stress than ever before. But importantly, because this is about positive youth development, importantly, not all youth who experience stress experience the negative outcomes. So now let's draw our attention to what makes that difference. What makes the difference? And that's best explored in the literature on resilience. And so let's take a look. I'm just going to highlight 1 or 2 of the studies just to kind of get us in the research and understanding where this origin comes from. We need to remember too that research is a muscle. It's something we can build and strengthen. It is not a trait. I hear people saying, oh, well, they're a resilient individual. Instead of labeling, we all get to choose. We get to choose to develop our resilience. It takes time. It takes practice. It is a muscle. It's just like courage. It's just like forgiveness. It takes time. When we think about lenses to adopt, think about the growth mindset. The other thing I think that's really important here is to remember that resilience is not developed in easy, comfortable times. Instead, resilience is developed through challenges, hardship, and suffering. So when our kids are experiencing hardship, as I tell my students who I taught a statistics course and then basic research and advanced research methods this year, it was hard. And I reminded them as we're going through all the stats, if you're struggling, if you want to pull your hair out, you are growing. You are growing. You are building resilience. You are building those muscles that you need. So I had one student say, well, do you need to have the adverse conditions? Do you need to have the challenge in order to build the resilience? Research suggests yes. And you could see Michael Rudder's work talks a lot about that. Helen Keller once said, character is never developed with ease and quiet. It's only through trial and suffering. It's not the ability to bounce back. We want more for our youth. We actually want our youth to go forward. It's getting stronger. And that is important. And that bouncing forward has to do with understanding the plasticity of growth in our brain. So let's take us to one study that actually began in 1955, and it was with Emmy Werner and Ruth Smith. And they did a study for all the children born on the island of Kauai during that year. And in general, they found, as you see on the slide, that most of the children came from very poor families. Several grew up with parents who were alcoholics, mentally ill. They had perinatal perinatal stress. They didn't graduate from high school. Their parents had family environments that were engulfed in chronic discord. And so to their, what they thought is that most of those kids were what they called vulnerable, that many of those children they followed, and keep in mind, they followed them for 40 years. Many of those children did develop, by age 10, did develop serious problems. Actually, 2 out of 3 serious problems. But the real story isn't those 2 out of 3. The real story is that 1/3 of those children actually were able to thrive in that condition. And so they then studied what were the characteristics, what makes those kids resilient, what makes those kids experience positive developmental outcomes. And here's just a glimpse at what they found. And again, think about these findings and how it relates to your work. What they found is those kids were able to exercise control, which is related to self-efficacy. Remember the ABCs in me. Those kids were able to seek out and accept support. I found when we have a mentoring program at Penn State Barron, and I found that kids need practice, adults need practice doing this. So we do a lot of role plays around asking for help. The kids who thrived also had at least one good friend, and they were able to use cognitive restructuring and retell their narrative in a positive way. In other words, when you think about what's on the screen here, they were able to grow positive developmental outcomes. And so how do we begin to build resilience and promote positive youth development? The question always comes, well, where do we start? I would suggest to you, in order to promote positive youth development, which again is based on Richard Lerner's work, and he comes up with 5 C's that we have already referred to, we have to grow their competence, their confidence, their connection, their character or integrity, and then their compassion. And the 6th C is we have to give them a chance to contribute to a greater good. So whether you're working with a youth organization or you're working with students or in your family, what kind of environment can you help them provide where they're actually contributing something meaningful? Now, remember, we started talking about the culture. So it's up to us to create a new culture. And as we think about creating a new culture, one that's not self-serving, one that promotes compassion, one that promotes connection, meaningful relationships, we have to look at our own lenses. We have to be willing to consider the lens through which we look. In other words, and I like this quote, gratitude doesn't change what we have in front of us. It changes the way we see what we have, because what we see changes everything. If you haven't had a chance to see this quick clip, I'm going to show it to you. It's of a boy who's colorblind, and this just documents the first time he's given glasses to actually see color. And I think it's a nice description of how we need to remember that we too may need to put on new lenses. I'm having a little trouble.
Buddy, can you look at the Jason, look out at the
The
frisbees.
frisbees. Can you see them? Can you see the differences?
Just a good example of the power of our lenses. We have to work really hard to change what we see in our kids. You know, we tend to label kids. We tend to label kids, that's this kid who does this or this kid who does this. If you look at this picture here, you're going to either see a horse or a frog, depending upon how you focus and what you concentrate on. What I'd like us to close with in terms of our lenses before we go to 3 practical strategies is talk about the strengths perspective, which is an important component of positive youth development. And as we think about building resilience and building youth up, we need to consider the strengths perspective. Now, this is located, Death Valley, it's located near the border of California and Nevada, east of the Sierra Nevada mountains. It's actually the largest national park south of Alaska, and it's known for its extremes. It's extremely hot. It's killed people in the past. It does not forgive those who are not careful. Let me give you another quick close up picture of it. But what's interesting about this place, when the conditions are right, looks like this. You see, there were seeds underneath. There are seeds underneath. It always had the potential for life. It's up to us as educators and counselors to provide those conditions. See a child differently, we see a different child. Now, what I'd like to do is go ahead and finish up by talking about 3 specific strategies. Before we do that, I'd like to hear from you in the chat, just one thing that resonated with you that has come up. Go ahead and put that in the chat, please. I'll give you a few minutes. Okay, I have a few more come in. ABCs and me, good. And I think we have 2 more. Okay, thank you. Resilience is a muscle, good. Adolescent brain development, perfect. Okay, thank you all for your comments. Now let's draw our attention as we close out the second half, and let's look at 3 ways actually to grow resilience and positive youth development. I know there was something in the chat about romanticizing resilience, and I certainly don't want to do that. And all of us have gone through hardship, some more than others. And obviously there's a whole other research on the importance of validating. What I'm merely suggesting is that positive youth development is the other side. We can't just look at the deficits model. We also need to look at the resilience model. Now, 3 ways to grow resilience. Do you remember the adolescent brain development and growing our prefrontal cortex? This is what is still developing. So we're going to talk about how to actually grow the prefrontal cortex and 3 ways to grow the prefrontal cortex. The first way, we'll look at the P, it's just PFC. We're going to cultivate purpose. There's a lot of research that suggests, I'm going to try to get a pen up there. There's a lot of research to suggest on purpose. And remember, this would be the me for ABCs and me, that in order to cultivate purpose, we need to give roles and responsibility. If you look at William Damon's work, William Damon is he's an educational professor at Stanford University, and he talks about not so much the stress of being an adolescent, it's that they feel meaningless and that we need to do more to give them purpose. And so when we think about that, what is purpose? Purpose, an easy way to think about this, it's passion plus service. And Joanne Deek talks about, she's another psychologist, she reminds us genuine inward self-esteem, which we want for our youth, is only experienced by giving outward. And again, that's a cultural shift for us. We also know purpose is related to identity development. And so again, that's a whole other webinar, but we need to think about how adolescents see themselves. Take a look at this. The meaning of life is to find your gift, and the purpose of life is to give it away. Picasso. What I'd like us to consider is, instead of just thinking about finding your purpose, is building your purpose. And I want to give accolades to Carol Dweck's work for this. Carol Dweck talks about and challenges us. We need to build our purpose. It's too much pressure where, well, what's your purpose? What's your purpose? You don't go out with binoculars and try to find it. You build it. And furthermore, you don't just have one. There are often many shared purposes. We also know that students need to think about how they can contribute to the world. That's related to their purpose. Living with purpose actually changes genes. And I love this research. And this research suggests that if you want to do something for the positive, help youth to discover, to build. Purpose improves our antiviral response, reduces risk of inflammatory disease. And this has come up study after study. So the first P is we have to work strategy to actually help our youth build purpose. A lot of that we do through mentoring and through working with other organizations. Let's look at the F. Number 2, it's just cultivate PFC. The F is forgiveness. Now, there is a lot of research, Enright does a lot of research in this. This is actually a pretty big literature. Forgiveness is related to less anger. It's related to more positive coping strategies, more positive emotions. And remember, adolescents struggle with anger. We saw that because they tend to read anger. Adolescents are also more negative than any other time period. So we really need to help with this. Think about the subcortical system. We know that forgiveness has a powerful impact on reducing aggression, reduces negative emotion, and is a gift for the youth themselves. As a resource, if you go to berkeley.edu, go to Greater Good, there are a lot of resources on forgiveness there. Forgiveness also promotes positive adjustment. I'd be remiss if we leave forgiveness without acknowledging how this happens. We at Penn State did a study looking at inducing forgiveness. And one way we did that with children, these were children in grades 3 through 8, we induced them to help them understand an aggressor's backstory, because everybody's got a backstory. And what we found is that those who understood someone's backstory were able to take another perspective. They were more likely to forgive, and their mental health was better. We don't get to forgiveness without promoting empathy. Empathy is a very important part of positive youth development. Remember the C of compassion. Challenge your youth to replace the word hate, which they use a lot, with the word pain. Help them to understand someone else's backstory. So when we think about empathy, practice building students' empathy levels. One way we do this is we have students interview each other. You can do this if you have to do it through Zoom, do it through Zoom or whatever it may be, particularly students that don't hang around together, have them interview each other, get to know each other. We use something and we're trained in something called narrative 4. And this story exchange is a really beautiful, intentional strategy to building empathy. It allows youth to understand and to be trained in deep listening, which again, because of their brain development, sometimes they need help trying to slow everything down. Well, what are the trends with empathy? How are we doing? And according to a meta-analysis that was done, empathy levels have decreased over time. And so this is important to remember. Another strategy that we reviewed is that it's always a good idea to help youth make the most generous assumption they can make about a person's intentions. Said another way, Yeager and Dweck has done work on this. David Yeager has done a lot of work on this. And he points out in his research that it's never to your youth's advantage to think someone did something to them on purpose, to hurt them on purpose. And you may say, well, what if they did? Doesn't matter. That intent is really damaging. And so I'm talking about attribution and helping youth narrate what their story looks like. And so we've talked about stress. Let's take a look at how to thrive in the face of stress. What we've just highlighted then is using empathy. Now, why empathy? The other reason it's important to lead with empathy is that when we are empathic and practice, notice the use of word practice, it takes time. When we're practicing empathy, it creates a sense of trust. It creates a sense of cooperation. It also releases a neurotransmitter called oxytocin. When we give and receive empathy, it produces oxytocin. And you may think, well, wait, isn't oxytocin that childbirth hormone? Yeah, it is. And oxytocin, again, is a big deal. So empathy actually helps produce this. Oxytocin was studied by Paul Zak, and he found it actually promotes positive relationships. And so you may say, well, this often called love hormone, can you actually artificially create environments which increase this? And what he found is there are some practical ways to increase oxytocin. As we talked about, number one, you want to increase the empathy, but you also want to make sure you are using eye contact. He has a lot of information in his work about the importance of applying the research and teaching youth and adults to listen with their eyes, the importance of eye contact. The other thing he's found that increases oxytocin is using technology to actually serve others. When we provide environments, again, we're here because we're promoting positive youth development. We need to provide the environment where they could serve others. Not only does that make them feel good, they're going to produce oxytocin. It's going to improve the relationships between others. As an aside, higher oxytocin is correlated with more giving. The more oxytocin you have, the more likely you are to give. The other practical way his research talks about is promote laughter. When you're working with youth, take some time, just have fun. You may say, well, I'm in a counseling position and it's not so fun, or I'm teaching a class, it's not so fun. Find something. Our students are always finding little things on YouTube. Remember, oxytocin is a group chemical. And so if you can consider sharing a brief, funny clip, that might be a good way to get your students, if they can, releasing some oxytocin. This is one of my students sent to me. All right, you get the gist. You get the gist. So oxytocin's a big one. Our third strategy, we've talked about cultivate that connection. Well, how do we increase social support? How do we do that? What does that look like? In thinking about the answer to this one, or one of the answers, I'm going to go and turn back to the research. I want you to think about what predicts or could predict happiness, more life satisfaction, more connection, less depression. Some answers in the past have been power, intelligence, being beautiful, money, strengths, and none of those did all of that. None of those predicted happiness, life satisfaction, connection, and less depression. What did was gratitude. Gratitude is actually a relatively underexplored construct, and it's linked with many scientific positive findings. More satisfaction with family and friends. It also changes your brain. If you remember, we had the cortical system and the subcortical system. Gratitude changes your brain, and those changes remain after 3 months. And that was the work of Brown and Wong in 2017. They showed greater activation in the medial prefrontal cortex. And well, what did they do? They did a simple activity. They invited youth to write a letter of gratitude. That's it. That was all they did. It was a very cheap as interventions go, but the effects were very, very strong. What kind of benefits? Well, leads to more pro-social behavior. It helps to lead to enhanced feelings of value and security. And it focuses kids on ways others have helped them. Now, if you just look at this slide for a minute, this can kind of give you an idea of the importance of where we were with the developmental changes. This addresses some of those adolescent developmental changes. And so in closing, what I'd like to do is just have us try it. I'd like us to think about someone in your life who was really influential. And then you can invite yourself or students to write down what or why or what the person did that was so important to you. That's a practical strategy. Let's take a look at what that looks like in action.
Shut up.
What? Wait.
I was going to be so embarrassed.
What makes you happy? Having fun? Hanging out with friends? Delicious food? Making money? Well, consider this. Psychologists have scientifically proven that one of the greatest contributing factors to overall happiness in your life is how much gratitude you show. Yeah? Think about that. Go ahead and marinate on it for a second. You can thank me later if you want. It'll make you feel better according to this study. You go ahead and click on it and read it if you want. Or you can keep watching because we read it and we thought it might be fun to test out for ourselves. We gathered a selection of volunteers to act as our subjects. First, we gave them a test. They didn't know what we were looking for, but it gave us a pretty good idea of their current level of happiness. We asked them to close their eyes and think of somebody who was really influential in their life, somebody who did something really amazing or important for them. We had them write down as much as they could about why this person was so important. Now, a lot of them thought at this point the experiment was over, until we really put them on the spot and tried to get them to call that person and read what they wrote about them. Thank you, Jessica. We're gonna have you call your mother. So who is that right person for you?
Person is my sister, Erica.
We're gonna give Erica a call.
Okay.
Who'd you end up picking?
Friend of mine, Craig Ains.
Her name is Dora.
A college accounting instructor.
Really? Is this somebody you're still in touch with today?
No, I'm assuming that he's passed on.
That's a
To the
shame.
great beyond.
You up for it?
Yes.
What would you say if we called up Dora?
Oh, well, we can try, but she lives in Britain.
In Britain?
Oh, no, never by heart, dude. This is awful.
That's fine. I don't know my mom's number by heart.
If it's true that those who are going on are looking down on us, maybe he read my chicken scratch.
Hey, sweetheart.
Hey, how you doing?
Yeah.
You got a second? Where you at, in the hotel?
I am. I'm in the hotel. You scared me when you asked if I had a second something's wrong.
No, I'm on like this little TV show, and they told me to talk about the person that influenced me the most, and I picked you, and they're making me call you. They're making me call you.
Oh, wonderful.
Hi, you reached Craig. I'm not here right now.
At the tone, please record your message.
Oh, come on.
Hello?
Hi,
Hi.
Erica. It's me.
All right, so I got to read you this paragraph. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Go ahead,
All right.
sweetheart.
All right, the person that influenced me the most would be my mother, Marlo Dawson. She is a single mother of 2. She is a very hard worker and dedicated to her family.
Hey, Craig. This is Loie. This is going to be a funny little voicemail, so I hope you enjoy it.
I'm so sorry for calling you at 4 o'clock in the morning.
I have to read this to you, okay? And you can't say anything, or I don't know. You can respond, but I probably will just keep going. Okay?
Is everything okay?
Yes, but I have to read this out loud to you.
The person who has had the biggest impact on my life outside of Jesus Christ, who is responsible for my existence, was my college accounting instructor. He had a joy and enthusiasm for his job like no other teacher I have ever known.
I love her to death, and she keeps me going with positive talk. She is a woman that knows what she wants and won't give up until it is achieved.
Oh, something. I don't know what. I'm about to cry because it's so beautiful. I have to say that it's just wonderful.
I first met Craig on an independent feature film set in Whitefish, Montana. I recently have been sending Craig a lot of positive thoughts as he's suffered a series of health problems. Despite his medical problems, he's continued to work and take pleasure in the small things in life, like sitting quietly with his wife, Janine, on the porch. Erica is my older sister and my best friend. Sometimes it even feels like we are twins. She's my #1 fan and my #1 supporter. She makes me happy because despite all my mistakes and my decisions, she still loves me no matter what.
Your friendship is everything. And you are one of the most important person in my life.
Even when she has a kid and many children, I will love her more than her kids. Okay, maybe not. I will never forget when she flew 3,000 miles at the drop of a phone call to save me from a breakup.
I'm being blessed by having a son like you. I love you.
Bye.
Why did you do that to me?
I don't know, because they made me do it.
Thank you for picking up. Bye, sweetie.
And then they're like, here, you're going to write this letter. And then I wrote like this whole long ass letter, which, I don't write. And then all of a sudden they're like, hey, guess what? Now we're going to call her and you're going to read her this letter. And I was like, what the
Before we let them go, we gave our subjects one more happiness test. Now, we mixed up and rephrased the questions so they didn't know they were taking the same test twice. For those who took the time to actually write something down but couldn't make the phone call for whatever reason, we saw happiness increase between 2 and 4%. Good, but not exactly mind-blowing. Now, for those who actually picked up the phone and personally expressed their gratitude, we saw increases between 4 and 19%. So either way, expressing your gratitude will make you a happier person. But you want to know something really interesting? The person who experienced the biggest jump in happiness was the least happy person who walked in the door. What does that mean? That means if you're having a particularly tough time, trying this out will more likely have a greater impact on you. Trust me. I'm in a lab coat. In fact, while you're at it, film it and upload it to us, and we'll do something awesome with it. I'm Julian, and this has been The Science of Happiness.
Okay, how about questions for me before Jordan closes up? Anything at all?
Does look like we have a couple questions that came through in the chat. Somebody asked, when you talk about 4 basic needs, are you referring to socio-emotional needs? Since they don't cover physical needs, I'm just trying to figure out where that fits in with physical needs.
Sure. Really good question. And so developmentally, we know that children have 3 domains. That's biological, cognitive, and socio-emotional. And so, Sheila, you're absolutely right that this is socio-emotional needs, that the acceptance, belonging, control, and meaningful existence. Thank you for the question. Any others?
Thank you. I do have another one. It is, I work on teaching my students goal setting. It's something that some of them really struggle with. A lot of times they tell me they have no clue what they're going to do after high school, or if they're even going to graduate. What are some specific strategies I can use to help them change their mindset about this?
Good. So some specific strategies about goal setting. Goal setting is a big deal, and goal setting is actually involved in the development of hope, something that's another webinar. So the development of hope, when you think about that, it is related to the goals. And so Carol Dweck's work talks a lot about that. And on the Search Institute, you could go to that, searchinstitute.org, and it's a website, and it will have a lot of free activities there for you. And it's really giving your youth an opportunity to try out new things and to see what they enjoy, to see what they're good at. So I would check out their developmental assets and check out the Search Institute. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. We do have about 2 more minutes now. If you have any other questions, please put them in the chat. I will read out one more. What are some ways you recommend making connections before content when we are working with teens virtually?
Yeah. That's a really good question, and it's been very challenging. One of the things that's been helpful for us is that we use mentoring, and so we have our college students mentoring our first year students, and so our juniors mentoring our freshmen. If you're working with high school students or youth, think about having adults or just having adults a year or 2 ahead, and have them come up with things on Zoom. They have been so creative. Our youth are so good with technology. And so if you remember the C for control, we empower students every week. A group of them get to lead us through the connection activity, and that increases their responsibility, and they all also get to do it. So that's been very helpful. So just as an idea, that's been very helpful for them.
Awesome, thank you. I don't see any other questions coming through the chat, but if anyone has anything that comes up after this, feel free to email either myself or you can email us at updates@hct.org. And to continue your learning, you can go to our online learning modules at learn.hct.org. One that is available, would be relevant to a lot of you, is the Introduction to Facilitation. There are many, many more. And you can go on to the next slide. Is that the last one? Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. And thank you, Dr. Nixon. I don't know about anybody else, but that video at the end, I was like, oh, I have to come off camera. I really have to get it together. So I hope everyone else enjoyed that as well. It looks like Dr. Nixon just put her email in the chat. So also feel free to copy and paste that with any questions for her. And thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Jordan, anything else I can do for you guys or Megan?
No, but you are all good to go. I'll follow up with you in an
Okay.
email. I just didn't want to end it yet because folks were, if they
Sure.
wanted to get your
Sure,
email.
no trouble,
but-
no trouble. And if you need anything else, just reach out, okay?
Perfect. Sounds good. Thank you so much.
You guys have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye.